There's a moment just before everything changes, when the world goes quiet in a way that feels wrong. Not peaceful, wrong. Like the air is holding its breath because it already knows what's coming and you don't. That moment came for everyone who was there that day, and none of them saw it coming. His name was Elias Cord. Not a name that showed up in history books the way generals and politicians do. Not the kind of name carved into marble or printed on the side of a building. But in the circles where it mattered, in the dry, windswept ranges where men tested themselves against distance and stillness and their own heartbeat, that name landed like a stone dropped in a quiet pond. You felt the ripple before you understood where it came from. He was 51 years old the morning this story begins. That surprises people when they hear it, because 51 sounds like the age of a man winding down, a man passing the torch, a man watching from the sideline with a cup of coffee and a comfortable chair. Elias Cord was none of those things. He was the kind of 51 that looked like a compressed version of something more dangerous. Thick through the shoulders, quiet in the eyes, with hands that moved with the particular steadiness of a man who had spent decades making peace with patience. He had grown up in a place called Harlan County, Kentucky, where the hills come down so steep they shade out the afternoon sun, and the winters feel like they last 9 months. His father was a miner. His grandfather was a miner. There was an expectation, the kind that doesn't get spoken out loud because it doesn't have to, that Elias would follow them down. That the cold dust would find its way into his lungs the same way it had found its way into theirs. But Elias had different hands. Not softer, not weaker, just different. His hands were made for precision, for the kind of work that requires you to stop breathing at exactly the right second, and trust that what you've calculated in your head, and in your gut, and in the tension of your trigger finger will arrive at the target the way you intended. His father recognized it first. Not with pride, not right away, but with the particular recognition of a man who sees something in his child that he cannot explain and cannot contain. He handed Elias his first rifle at age 9. By 11, Elias was out shooting grown men at county competitions. By 14, people drove 3 counties over just to watch him. There was nothing flashy about it. That's the thing people who weren't there don't understand. They picture a prodigy as someone who performs, someone who plays to the crowd, someone with flair. Elias was the opposite. He went still. He went somewhere inside himself that had no name, no address, no weather. And from that place, he shot. The bullet went where the bullet was supposed to go. Every time, without drama, without ceremony, without any visible effort at all. That absence of effort is what made grown men uneasy. He left Harlan County at 17 with a duffel bag, a rifle case, and exactly $40. Not because he was running from something, though Harlan County had plenty worth running from, but because the county had given him everything it had to give, and the world outside was the only range left worth shooting on. He joined the Army at 18. The Army, to its considerable credit, recognized within 3 weeks what it had on its hands. He was routed into a marksmanship program that most recruits never even learned existed. He did things there, things that are documented in reports that still carry classification markings, things that the men who were present for speak about in the careful, measured tone of people describing something they half believe they imagined. He served for 11 years. He came home with no visible wounds, which fooled some people, and with eyes that had seen things that don't leave, which fooled no one who looked carefully enough. After the Army, he disappeared for a while. That happens with men like him. The world doesn't have a clean slot for what they are once the uniform comes off, and the adjustment is not always graceful. For 3 years, he worked construction in Nevada, drove trucks in Arizona, did odd jobs in the kind of towns that don't make it on any map worth printing. He wasn't lost exactly. He was recalibrating, finding the distance between who he had been in that classified room with a scope to his eye and who he was going to be now that no one was giving him targets anymore. He found his way back to the rifle through competition. It started small, local shoots, regional tournaments. A friend from the Army pulled him into it half as a joke. "Hey, Cord, come show these weekend warriors what a real shot looks like." Elias came. He showed them. The joke stopped being a joke very quickly. Within 2 years, he was competing nationally. Within 4, he was on a circuit that took him to places he'd only seen in photographs. He didn't win every competition he entered. Nobody does. But the way he lost was as instructive as the way he won. Clean, quiet, no excuses, back to the range the next morning. He studied his misses the way other men studied their victories, with a forensic attention that bordered on obsession. He wanted to understand not just what had gone wrong, but where the error had begun, how many steps back in the chain of decision and preparation the fault line had first appeared. That discipline built something over time. It built a reputation. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that requires a publicist and a social media presence and a branded merchandise line. The kind that travels person to person, word of mouth, through the specific underground of people who know what precision shooting actually demands. When Elias Cord's name came up in those conversations, it came up with a particular tone. Respectful. Slightly careful. The tone you use when you're talking about something that is genuinely good at what it does, and you don't want to oversell it because the thing itself doesn't need the help. He had a saying, picked up somewhere along the years, that people who knew him quoted back like it was scripture. The rifle doesn't miss. The shooter does. Find a shooter. He meant himself by that. He always meant himself. That philosophy, personal accountability, so absolute it collapsed the distance between the tool and the hand holding it, was what made him different from the technically gifted shooters who plateaued and never understood why. Elias never plateaued because he never stopped looking for the fault in himself. He never ran out of things to correct. He never decided he was finished, which is why what happened on that range, on that particular Tuesday morning in October, hit people the way it did. Because Elias Cord did not come to that range to show off. He came because he was invited to give a demonstration as part of a national marksmanship training program, a clinic for up-and-coming competitive shooters, young men and women who had talent and needed direction, who had been identified by coaches and coordinators as people worth investing in. 22 of them, ages ranging from 19 to 28. Sharp, motivated, already ahead of most people their age in the technical fundamentals. They had been told a famed marksman would be joining them for the day. They had not been told his name. That was intentional. The coordinator who arranged it, a woman named Patricia Dunn, who had been running these clinics for 15 years and had a gift for understanding what young competitors needed that went well beyond technique, wanted the morning to land without the weight of expectation distorting it. Let the work speak first, she had told the staff. Then the name. The 22 of them arrived at 7:30. The range was at a federal training facility in Northern Virginia, surrounded by pine trees that went still when the wind dropped and made the whole place feel cut off from ordinary time. There was mist on the ground near the low end of the range. The air had that cold, clean quality that serious shooters privately consider a gift, the kind of morning where the atmosphere cooperates and you have no excuse. They set up. They warmed up. Patricia ran them through their opening exercises. She watched how they moved, how they settled, what their bodies did when they got prone and picked up their rifles. She made notes. She said almost nothing. That was her method. Observe first, counsel later, never interrupt someone's process before you understand it. At 8:45, a truck pulled into the gravel lot at the far end of the facility. One of the younger shooters, a 20-year-old from Georgia named Marcus Webb, who had a habit of tracking everything that moved in his peripheral vision, saw the truck and watched the driver get out. Average height, moving without hurry, carrying a single rifle case and a small bag. Marcus turned back to his lane. He didn't think anything of it. Elias Cord crossed the gravel lot and came through the side gate. Patricia met him there. They exchanged a handshake, and for quiet words that nobody close enough to overhear remembers clearly, just the shape of a greeting between two people who have a mutual respect that doesn't need a lot of ceremony. She walked him to the observation platform at the back of the range. He set his case down. He looked out at the 22 shooters in their lanes. He watched them for a long time, not casually, the way a doctor watches a patient, gathering information, reading things that aren't labeled, forming a picture that the person being observed can't see forming. He stood with his arms loose at his sides, and his weight settled evenly, and his face gave nothing away. Patricia stood beside him. She let him look. After about 4 minutes, he turned to her and said something. She nodded. He walked down to the first lane, where Marcus Webb was mid-drill, and crouched down beside him without announcing himself. Marcus heard the crunch of gravel and glanced over. He saw a man with gray at his temples and eyes that were doing something complicated and still. He didn't know who it was yet. He went back to his rifle. Elias watched one shot. Then he said, quietly, in a voice that carried exactly as far as it needed to, and not 1 inch further, "Your left elbow is doing the work your breath should be doing." Marcus didn't respond right away. He processed it. He adjusted. He shot again. The target downrange registered. Marcus stared at it for a second. Then he looked back at the man crouching beside him. Elias had already moved to the next lane. That was how the morning started. That was the quiet version of what was about to unfold. He went down the line, lane by lane, crouching or standing or lying flat, depending on what the shooter was doing, saying things that were brief and specific and arrived with the accuracy of the shots he was famous for. No praise that was empty, no criticism that was cruel, just the precise thing at the precise moment that the shooter needed to hear. By the time he reached the end of the line, the 22 shooters had figured out who he was. Not from an announcement, not from Patricia introducing him, from the quality of what he was giving them. You don't get corrections like that from someone who read about it in a manual. The buzz ran down the lanes in whispers. Marcus Webb, already repositioning in his lane with Elias's adjustment still sitting in his body like a small revolution, heard someone 3 positions down say the name. He turned it over in his head, checked it against what he'd just experienced, felt the confirmation of it settle somewhere in his chest the way a large and important thing sometimes settles. Not with fanfare, not with drama, just with weight. Elias Cord made his way back to the observation platform. He opened his rifle case. The morning was about to change again. Patricia called a break. She gathered the 22 shooters at the briefing area behind the lanes, and she let the quiet sit for a moment. The particular quiet of 22 young people who were still processing what they've been given and what it means. Then she told them who he was. Not with flourish, just the facts, the record, the service, the circuit. She told them that he would now give a demonstration. She told them the distance. One of the shooters, a 24-year-old named Diane Shun for Washington State, who had been one of the best in her age group for 3 consecutive years, and who did not impress easily, said later that when Patricia said the distance, the first thing she thought was that there had been a mistake. That Patricia had misspoken. That the number Patricia said was a number Diane associated with controlled laboratory conditions and ideal equipment, and not with a Tuesday morning in October on a range in Northern Virginia with mist on the ground, and a man who had driven up in an ordinary truck. The number Patricia said was not wrong. Elias Cord picked up his rifle. He walked to the firing line. He looked downrange for a long moment, the way he had looked at those 22 shooters, gathering, reading, forming the picture. Then, he turned to the group behind him. He said, "Try to keep pace." Nobody laughed. Not because it wasn't slightly funny in the dry, understated way it was intended, but because the way he said it made it sound less like a joke and more like a warning, like the reasonable advice of a man who knows what's about to happen and is giving you a fair chance to prepare. He turned back to the range. He went prone, and everything that happened next, the thing that would be talked about for years, that would be described in training rooms and competitions and late-night conversations between people who were there and people who wish they had been, began. The ground was cold through his jacket. That's the first thing Elias noticed when he went prone. Not the targets, not the wind reading, not the 22 people standing behind him watching. The cold of the ground coming up through the fabric, settling into his ribs, his hips, his elbows. He noticed it, and he didn't fight it. He let it become part of the picture, part of the total environment he was absorbing before he began. Cold ground means still air near the surface. Still air near the surface changes certain variables. His mind filed it, moved on. He built his position the way a man lays a foundation, deliberate, sequential, nothing left to chance. Left elbow angled precisely. Right hand curled around the grip with tension that was calibrated rather than gripped. Cheek to stock. Eye to scope. The world narrowed to a circle of magnified light, and at the center of that circle, 601 yards downrange, a steel target the size of a dinner plate. Behind him, 22 people stopped breathing. Not metaphorically, literally. The collective inhale and hold of people who understand on some level that what they are about to witness is a rare thing, and that any disturbance they create, even the audible disturbance of their own lungs, feels like an intrusion they don't want to commit. Patricia stood to the right of the group. Her arms were crossed, and her expression was the calm, practiced neutrality of a woman who had seen a lot of demonstrations over 15 years and still was not entirely sure what was about to happen. That uncertainty, in somewhat of her experience, was itself telling. Elias lay still. This is the part that people who don't shoot don't understand. The stillness before the shot is not waiting. It is working. The body is doing enormous amounts of invisible labor, regulating, compensating, reading, deciding. The heart is beating, and the pulse is moving through the fingertip, and the eye is tracking the crosshair's microdrift, and The lungs are measuring the space between exhale and the next inhale, where the body is most still, where the machinery goes briefly quiet. Every competitive shooter knows this space. Most of them spend their entire careers trying to get more comfortable in it. Elias Cord had spent 34 years building a home there. He found the space. He fired. The sound on an outdoor range is different from what people imagine before they've experienced it. Not the flat crack of movies, but something with a physical dimension, a pressure that you feel in the sternum before the ear fully registers it. The shot went out and downrange, and the steel plate rang with a sound like a hammer on a bell, clear and definitive, rolling back across the range. One of the younger shooters in the group, a boy named Tyler Reese from Ohio who was 19 and had the particular combination of raw talent and insufficient humility that makes coaches earn their salaries, said under his breath, "Okay. Just that. Okay." The involuntary compression of acknowledgement. Elias cycled the bolt without lifting his cheek from the stock. He fired again. Same ring. Same definitive sound. Same absence of drama. He fired a third time. Patricia uncrossed her arms. She was watching the target through binoculars. The 3 rounds had grouped in a cluster that, at 601 yards, was tighter than most competitive shooters achieve at half the distance. Not because Elias was using superior equipment. He was using a rifle that several of the 22 could have identified by manufacturer and model, nothing exotic, but because the man behind the equipment had made himself into a kind of precision instrument that the equipment was simply channeling. She lowered the binoculars. She said to the group, but not loudly, "Anyone want to look?" They passed the binoculars down the line. Each face that pressed them to their eyes went through a similar sequence: confusion, focus, recalibration. Diane Chin held them the longest. She was not looking at the group size itself, which was impressive enough. She was looking at the placement, the center of the plate. 3 holes so close together they were almost a single hole. She had the spatial memory of a trained shooter, and she was doing the math that competitive shooters always do, calculating what that grouping required in terms of wind doping, breath control, trigger discipline, position stability. The math came out with a number she didn't like because the number was too high. She handed the binoculars to the person next to her without saying anything. Elias had risen from the prone and was looking downrange with his naked eye, the way he always did after a group, reading the air between him and the target, checking his impressions against what the rounds had told him. He made a small adjustment in his head, filed it. He looked back at the group. "Come forward," he said. "Bring your rifles." This is what Patricia had arranged. Not just a demonstration, a parallel exercise. The 22 would attempt the same distance, same target configuration, same conditions, and Elias would walk among them while they shot, coaching in real time, connecting what they were seeing from the observation platform to what it felt like to actually execute the shot. It was the kind of teaching that can't happen in a classroom or a lecture hall, the kind that requires the attempt and the failure and the physical reality of a miss to create the conditions where the correction actually lands. They went to their lanes. "Sit up." The range master confirmed the distance, confirmed the target, confirmed wind flags at 3 positions downrange. The flags were barely moving. "Good morning. No excuse." They began. Elias moved among them again, but this time it was different. This time he was watching them shoot at distance, watching the full chain, preparation, position, breathing, trigger follow through, and the errors that had been minor at shorter distances became visible at 600 yards the way small cracks in a foundation become visible when the building gets tall. Everything that was wrong got louder. Everything that was right got tested. Marcus Webb, in his lane, went through his pre-shot routine with the correction Elias had given him that morning sitting in his body. Left elbow steady, breath doing the work. He settled into his position, found the target in his scope, traveled to that interior place where the decision gets made. He fired. He watched the trace, the brief, visible disturbance in the air that an experienced shooter can sometimes track, and he watched it arrive. High left, maybe 8 inches. He pulled a bolt. He thought about it, not with frustration. He had been doing this long enough to know frustration is a waste of the time you need for analysis. He thought about the trigger pull, the body position at the moment of ignition, the breathing. He found what he thought was the error. He made the adjustment in his body. He fired again. High left. 6 inches. Better. Not good. Elias appeared beside him without sound, crouching down. He watched Marcus's setup. He was quiet for a moment, taking the picture. "Your natural point of aim is off," he said. You're fighting your body to get the barrel where you want it instead of moving your whole position until the barrel wants to be there on its own. Marcus heard it. He sat up. He physically repositioned, shifted his entire body angle, reset his elbows, reacquired the target. He noticed immediately that the rifle felt different, less forced, like it was pointing at the target because that was where it wanted to point, not because he was holding it there. He fired. The steel rang. He felt it before he heard it. The absence of resistance that a clean shot has, a quality that shooters spend years chasing and immediately recognize when they finally find it. Elias put a hand briefly on Marcus's shoulder. Just a touch. Then, he was gone, moving to the next lane. Marcus stayed in his position for a moment. He felt the cold ground under him, the weight of the rifle, the echo of the ring still going in his ears. He understood that something had just been given to him that he would carry forward. Not just the technical correction, but the physical memory of what right felt like. That was the gift. Elias hadn't told him what to think. He had arranged conditions where Marcus's own body showed him. Down the line, things are going less cleanly. Tyler Reese, who had said okay with the easy confidence of someone watching from the outside, was 3 shots into his attempt and had not hit the target once. His position was technically sound, better than most in the group, actually, which was part of the problem. He had built a technically sound position and then filled it with a shooter who was fighting too hard, wanting it too much, making the kind of micro-adjustments between shots that are the enemy of grouping because they introduce variables faster than they solve them. Elias watched him from 3 lanes away for a while, not intervening yet, letting the pattern complete itself so the correction would have context. Tyler fired a 4th shot. Low this time. He muttered something. Elias walked over. He crouched down beside Tyler the way he had crouched beside Marcus, and he said nothing for a moment. He watched Tyler's hands on the rifle. He watched the tension in Tyler's jaw. How many adjustments have you made since your first shot? He asked. Tyler thought about it. 4. You shot 4 rounds and made 4 adjustments. I was compensating for wear, I know, Elias said. That's the problem. Tyler was quiet. 1 change per session, Elias said. Make 1 change. Shoot a group. See where the group goes. Then, make 1 more change. You're not solving 1 problem. You're introducing 4. Tyler processed this. The advice was not new. He had heard versions of it from his coaches. But hearing it from this man, in this moment, on this range with the evidence of 4 scattered misses sitting downrange was different. The advice had evidence now. It had proof. It was no longer a principle in a manual. It was a description of exactly what had just happened to him. He reset. He made 1 change, position only, no other adjustment. He went through his routine. He fired. The steel rang. Tyler turned his head and looked at Elias with an expression that had dropped entirely out of the easy confidence and landed somewhere more honest. Elias nodded once. Moved on. This was the rhythm of the morning. Movement and correction, correction and revelation, the slow building of a different understanding in 22 young people about what this discipline actually required. Not just the technical elements, which they had, but the interior architecture, the relationship between the shooter and the shot, the understanding that the rifle is the least complicated part of what is happening. Patricia watched from the platform with the expression of someone watching a very good teacher teach. Not performing teaching, not presenting teaching, actually doing it in the unglamorous, specific, endlessly patient way it actually works when it works. At 11 o'clock, Elias called a halt to the shooting session. He walked to the briefing area. The 22 followed him, rifles unloaded and cased. They gathered around the way students gather, some sitting on the low benches, some standing, all of them quieter than they had been at 7:30 that morning. The morning had done something to the noise in them. Not defeated them, fed them, actually, but fed them in a way that required processing. He stood in front of them and was quiet for a moment. Then, he said, every mistake you made out there today was a version of the same mistake. He had their full attention. You were trying to shoot the target, he said. You should have been building the conditions in which the target gets hit. He let that sit. There's a difference, he said. Trying to shoot the target is an act of will. Building the conditions is an act of discipline. Will fails under pressure. Discipline doesn't. You can will yourself through 100 meters at a local competition on a good day. You cannot will your way through the kind of distance and condition and pressure that will eventually find you. Only discipline survives that. Diane Chun, who had been listening with the focused stillness of someone transcribing, raised her hand. How do you build a discipline when you don't have access to these conditions for training? Elias looked at her. You don't need the conditions, he said. You need the process. The process is the same at 25 meters as it is at 600. If you can't do it right at 25 meters, you will absolutely not do it right at 600. The distance doesn't teach you discipline. The distance reveals whether you already have it. Go back to 25 meters and build it there. Then let the distance test it. She wrote something in the small notebook she had brought. He watched her write. There was something in his expression, not affection exactly, but recognition. The recognition of someone who sees a quality in another person that they know, from experience, is going to matter. He looked back at the whole group. One more thing, he said, and this is the only time I'm going to say it, so hear it properly. The range went quiet. The pine trees at the perimeter were still. The shot you're most afraid of missing is the shot you'll miss, he said. Fear of missing is not caution. It is a guarantee. If you go to the range to avoid failure, you will find it. You have to go to the range to build something. Build something. Then, the failure becomes information instead of a verdict. Nobody moved. He looked at them for another moment. Then, he picked up his rifle case. Lunch is at 12:30, Patricia said, to nobody in particular. The spell broke. The 22 began to move, talking to each other in the low, charged voices of people processing something significant. Marcus Webb stood by his lane for a moment longer than the others, looking downrange at the target he had finally hit, holding what the morning had given him in the way you hold something you don't want to drop. He didn't know yet that the afternoon was going to be different. None of them did. The afternoon was where Elias Cord stopped demonstrating and started competing against a standard, against conditions, against the particular version of himself that said he was done being patient and wanted to see what distance actually looked like when you stopped calibrating and started committing. Patricia knew what was coming. She had spoken to him the night before. She had asked him if he was certain. He had said what he always said when people asked him that kind of question. The rifle doesn't miss. She had understood what he meant. At 12:30, they broke for lunch. At 1:45, they would come back. And the morning's lesson, careful, specific, patient, generous, would become context for something else entirely. Something that none of the 22 had prepared for. Something that the range master, when he recounted it later to colleagues, described not as a demonstration. He called it a reckoning. Lunch was sandwiches on folding tables under a canopy at the back of the facility. Ham and turkey and a cooler full of water bottles and a bowl of fruit that nobody touched until the sandwiches were gone. Normal. Ordinary. The kind of meal that doesn't deserve description except for what was happening in the room while it was being eaten. 22 young people and one man who had spent 34 years turning himself into something they were only beginning to understand, all sitting within 40 feet of each other. And the conversation that filled the canopy had the particular quality of a conversation between people who are still inside an experience and only beginning to find language for it. Tyler Reese was sitting with 3 others his age, 2 men and a woman, and he was talking with his hands in the way people talk when an idea is moving through them faster than words can carry it. The correction Elias had given him was inside him now, working. He was reconstructing the morning's shots in sequence, identifying the exact moment in each of the 4 missed attempts where the compulsive overadjustment had entered, mapping it against what the single change approach had produced. He was making it into a system he could use. That's what good young competitors do with good instruction. They metabolize it immediately, hungrily, converting it into future practice before the experience has even fully ended. Elias was at the far end of the table, half a sandwich eaten, talking to Patricia in a low voice. He was looking at the range. Patricia was looking at him. She said, "You're going to do the thing." It wasn't a question. He looked at her. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile, but was related to one. "I told you last night," he said. "I know what you told me last night. I'm asking if you've decided." "I decided last night." Patricia was quiet for a moment. She looked at the range, then back at him, then at the 22 young people at the table who didn't know what they were about to be asked to witness. "What distance?" she said. He told her. Patricia put her water bottle down on the table slowly and looked at it. "Elias," she said, "I've done it before. You've done it before in conditions that were. Conditions today are fine. The wind in the afternoon is going to change." "I know." She looked at him. This was the version of him she had learned to recognize over the years of this working relationship. The version that was quiet in a way that was not peace, but decision. The version that had made up its mind somewhere the night before or the week before years ago and was now simply waiting for the world to arrive at the moment he had already mapped. She said, "All right." She said, "I'll set it up." At 1:45, the 22 came back to the briefing area. The afternoon sun had come out, and the mist was completely gone, and the range looked different in direct light. The targets sharper, the flags at the 3 positions downrange now lifting and falling with the irregular movement of an afternoon wind that had arrived exactly as Patricia had said it would. Not violent wind, not the kind that moves everything and justifies missing. The kind that requires constant reading, that enters the calculation as a variable that never holds still long enough to be called constant. The difficult kind. Patricia stood in front of the group. She told them that the afternoon session would be different from the morning. This was the part of the clinic they had not been briefed on in advance. She explained that they were going to witness a shot, a single attempt at a distance she then named, and that after witnessing it they would have an opportunity to attempt the same distance themselves. She named the distance. The group went quiet in a different way than they had gone quiet that morning. The morning quiet had been respectful. This quiet had an edge to it. It was the quiet of 22 people doing math that wasn't adding up. Diane Chin's notebook was in her hand. She did not write anything. She stared at the number. Patricia had said the way you stare at something that you understand in theory, but your body hasn't caught up to yet. The distance was not a record. That's important to understand. Records are clinical things produced in optimal conditions with purpose-built equipment and teams of support personnel and years of preparation aimed at a single moment. What Patricia was describing was not a record attempt. It was a man on a Tuesday afternoon on a range in Northern Virginia with a rifle he had driven here in a regular truck, attempting a shot that would require him to account for variables that a record-setting attempt would have eliminated by design. The range master, a former Army man named Gerald Okafor, who had been running this facility for 8 years, and who brought to every situation a face of such comprehensive professional blankness that you could not tell if he was impressed or bored unless you knew him well, was already at the far end of the range setting up the target. Gerald knew him. He was impressed. Elias walked to the firing line. He did not perform anything on the way there. Did not look at the group over his shoulder, did not adjust his jacket, did not project the composed confidence that some competitors use at this moment like a costume. He walked the way he always walked, economically, without extra movement, like a man who has already spent his performance budget somewhere invisible, and what you're seeing is what remains after everything unnecessary has been subtracted. He set down his bag. He took out his range book, a worn, spiral-bound notebook with the particular character of something that has been used at close range for a long time, and he looked at his last 3 entries, written last night and this morning. He checked his data against the wind flags. He made one small notation. He put the book back in the bag. He opened his rifle case. Marcus Webb was standing at the front of the group. He had positioned himself there when Patricia named the distance because some instinct had moved him forward, the same instinct that moves you to the front of a crowd when you understand that the thing you're about to see is not going to look bigger from further back. He watched Elias remove the rifle from a case. He watched him check the action, mount the scope, settle the rifle into his shoulder once, briefly, then lower it and make a small adjustment to the bipod. Check the scope picture again. Everything was deliberate, unhurried, not slow, deliberate. There's a difference. Slow is wasted time. Deliberate is time that's doing something. The wind flag at the midpoint downrange lifted for 3 seconds, dropped, lifted again at a slightly different angle. Elias watched it. He went prone. The 22 went with him, not physically, but in some interior way, all of them finding that involuntary held breath again, all of them canceling the small movements of their own bodies as though their stillness could contribute something to his. He built his position. The wind flag moved. He was still. The wind flag settled. He was still. Patricia, watching with binoculars from the platform, described the next 40 seconds later as the most complete silence she had experienced on a range. Not the absence of sound. There was wind in the pines, a distant vehicle, the small atmospheric sounds of an outdoor space. But something in the human part of the scene had gone so quiet that the natural sounds seemed louder by comparison, like the people had briefly subtracted themselves from the equation. Elias exhaled. He fired. The sound went out across the range and vanished into the pine trees and the afternoon air, and then, after a period of time that was too long, and then, exactly right, the steel target at the far end rang. The sound traveled back clean and definitive and slightly delayed the way a long-distance shot always is, the small gap between the firing and the confirmation that is one of the defining sensations of this discipline. Gerald Okafor, downrange with binoculars, raised one arm. Thumb up. Marcus Webb made a sound. He would not later be able to accurately describe what sound it was. Not a word. Not exactly a word. Something closer to the involuntary vocalization of a person who has received information that their body processes faster than their language centers can organize. Diane wrote something in her notebook. 2 words quickly. Then, she looked back up. Tyler Reese, 3 positions back in the group, turned to the person beside him and found he had nothing to say. Elias cycled a bolt. He fired again. Gerald, downrange, raised his arm again. Elias fired a 3rd time. Gerald raised his arm a 3rd time. 3 shots. 3 confirmations. 3 rings from a target at a distance that the 22 were still metabolizing, still converting from a number Patricia had said into a physical reality that could fit into their understanding of what a human being with a rifle in their hands could actually accomplish. Elias rose from prone. He looked downrange for a moment. He checked his range book, made another notation, closed it. He looked back at the group. The group was not quiet anymore. The hellbreath quality had broken, and what replaced it was the sound of 22 people turning to each other and trying to begin the conversation that the moment demanded, the attempt to put shared words around something they had just experienced individually. It had the particular urgent energy of people who have seen the same thing and need to confirm it to each other, not because they doubt it, but because verifying it is part of absorbing it. Patricia let it run for a moment. She understood the value of the unstructured processing time. Then, she raised her voice. "You have 15 minutes, she said. Then, you get to attempt it." The conversation changed. The confirming energy became something more focused. Some of them moved to their lanes immediately. Some of them stood in place for a moment longer, recalculating, revising their expectations against what they had just seen and what it meant for what they were about to attempt. Marcus went to his lane and lay down and dry-fired 3 times, feeling his position, running the morning's corrections through his body like a quality check. Elias moved among them. He was not demonstrating anything now. The demonstration was finished. Now, he was something closer to a companion in the attempt, available, present, watching, but not interfering with what each shooter needed to do in their own interior process before they committed to the shot. Diane Chun, setting up in her lane, was doing something that Elias watched for a moment from a distance. She was working through a checklist, not a written one, a physical one, moving through each element of her position with a systematic focus that was different from the other shooters around her. She was not rushing. She was not performing. She was building. He recognized what she was doing because he had been doing the same thing since he was 11 years old. She fired her first attempt. Mississippi High, she thought. 15 inches, maybe more. She pulled the bolt. She did not make an adjustment. She went back through her checklist, found one element, the shoulder contact with the stock, that was slightly off, corrected it. One change. She fired again. Mississippi High, but less. Maybe 8 inches. She identified what she thought was the error. Made one change. She fired a 3rd time. The steel rang. She lay with her cheek against the stock and her eyes on the scope, and she let herself stay in that position for a moment. Not celebrating, not analyzing, just being there with the fact of what had happened. The way Elias had stood at the firing line and looked downrange after his group, reading the air. She was doing the same thing, holding the moment long enough to learn from it before releasing it. Elias was beside her without her noticing his arrival. "Good," he said. That was all. One word. But from him, in this context, with the weight of the morning behind it, it landed differently than it would have from another source. She looked at him. "Why did the first 2 miss high?" he asked. She told him what she thought. He listened. He considered. "Mostly right," he said. "One thing you missed." He described it. Brief, specific, impossible to misunderstand. She filed it. He moved on. Down the range, Tyler Reese was 3 shots in and had hit the target twice. Not the group he wanted. Not the consistency he was reaching for. But the discipline was different now. The single change approach was holding. He wasn't chasing the shots. He was building towards something. The patience was costing him, in the way patience always costs you in short term, but the shots that were landing for understood reasons rather than luck, and that difference was one of the most important things he would take away from the day. Elias came by his lane. He watched one shot. "You're anticipating the recoil," he said. Tyler froze. He had heard that correction before in his career. He had heard it enough times that he had convinced himself he'd fixed it. The certainty of that conviction was such that hearing it from Elias Cord on this particular shot, after this particular morning, was briefly humiliating in the way that only true corrections can be humiliating, the kind where the humiliation comes not from the error itself, but from the sudden recognition that you had been telling yourself a story. Elias watched his face. It's the hardest thing to fix, he said, because by the time you know it's happening, the shot is already ruined. You have to go so far back upstream that you fix it before it's had a chance to form. How? Tyler said. Stop trying to manage the recoil and start trusting the position. The position manages the recoil. That's its job. Your job is to build the position and then leave it alone. Tyler looked at the target downrange. Build and leave it alone, he said, partly to himself. Build and leave it alone, Elias confirmed. He moved on. The session ran for an hour. By the end of it, 14 of the 22 had hit the target at least once. 3 had hit it consistently enough to call it a group rather than a lucky round. Diane Chun had hit it 4 times in 5 shots. Marcus Webb had hit it twice and had a third shot that missed by a margin he could explain precisely, which in this discipline is almost as valuable as the hit. Elias gathered them at the briefing area for the last time. The afternoon sun was lowering. The pine trees at the perimeter were throwing long shadows across the near end of the range. The wind had come up slightly in the last 20 minutes, restless and irregular the way autumn wind gets in Virginia when it can't decide if it's done for the day. He stood in front of them. They were different people than they had been at 7:30. Not fundamentally different. They hadn't been transformed, hadn't had a conversion experience, weren't going home to rebuild everything from the ground up. But they were carrying something they hadn't carried at 7:30. A correction, each of them. A specific, physical, irreversible understanding of one thing they'd been getting wrong, and what right felt like when they finally found it. That is the unit of change in this discipline. Not epiphanies, not general improvement. One correction, filed in the body, carried forward. What you did today, Elias said, you won't fully understand for about 6 months. He looked at them. The correction I gave you this morning is sitting in your head right now. In 6 months, if you practice the right way, it will be sitting in your body. That's when it becomes yours. Not before. Don't think you own it yet. He paused. The distance you shot today is going to feel different in 6 months too. Not easier, but less impossible. Because the impossible thing and the very difficult thing look exactly the same from the outside until you've spent 6 months building the difference from the inside. Diane Chin's notebook was open. She was writing, but her eyes were on him. One last thing, he said. He looked at all of them. The 19-year-olds and the 28-year-olds and everyone between the technically talented and the raw and the disciplined and the ones who are going to have to fight harder for it than the others. When someone tells you to try to keep pace, he said, that's not arrogance. That's the most honest thing I can offer you. Because the pace I'm asking you to keep is not mine. It's the disciplines. The pace of doing this the right way, every time, whether anyone is watching or not, whether you're winning or losing, whether the conditions cooperate or make you pay for every inch. He picked up his rifle case. That pace, he said, is the only one worth keeping. He left the way he had arrived. Across the gravel lot, into the ordinary truck, down the road into the pine trees, and the late afternoon light, carrying nothing more than he had arrived with, leaving 22 people standing on a range in northern Virginia who were not the same as they had been that morning. Patricia watched the truck go until it turned out of sight. Then, she turned back to her clinic. There was still work to do. There is always still work to do. That, she understood, was exactly the point.